Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small. Dunn Street trains engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building, and we help leaders craft their own public narrative that tells a story that unites people and moves them to act together. And if you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel pretty daunting. That's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with experience that you can count on. And to find out more, simply go to their website, which is mauriceblackburn.com.au. And today's episode is also brought to you by our friends at SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energize the community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, just go to their website, which is swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast, which drops every Friday, that dives into the progressive issues and the campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on this week's episode, we are talking to the director for McKell, Victoria, which is Rebecca Thistleton. The Victorian State Budget was handed down on Tuesday by Treasurer Tim Pallas. And Rebecca is joining us this week just to give us a very quick speed round episode to unpack what was in the budget and how it was received. So I'm looking forward to that episode with Rebecca today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. And if you like the show, be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and Spotify when you're done listening, and leave us a review on Apple Podcast and Podchaser. And for all the links, don't forget to follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a cold and wet Wednesday evening on the lands of the Te Atiawa people. I'm in New Zealand tonight for this special Victorian budget episode, and joining me on the line back home, I'm assuming she's on Wurundjeri land, but she might want to correct me at some point, is the Victorian Director for the McKell Institute, which is the leading progressive research institute back home. Rebecca Thistleton, welcome for the first time on Socially Democratic. How are you?
Good, thanks so much, Stephen. When The Age described Socially Democratic as a little-known left-wing podcast and then went on to run a full transcript of your one-on-one with the Premier, I added doing this to my bucket list. So thanks very much for having me.
Well, we love to be a little-known podcast, and we continue to do so, and we thrive off of that, and we do appreciate The Age for giving us a lot of media that day. But it's great to have you on the show. Look, and I, as always, I'm always honest with our wonderful listeners, and always let them know that if I'm absolutely out of my depth when we're talking about something, I've been flat out with training some comrades over here in New Zealand for the last 2 or 3 days, and I've just been in between breaks trying to grab as much news as I could on Twitter about the budget that was handed down in Victoria yesterday. On Tuesday, we taped this on a Wednesday. So really, this is an episode for me, and I guess the rest of us, to get a download of actually what was in the budget. But before we do that, my first question really is, going into this budget, what was the perception of folks, particularly in the sort of the chattering class, the media, about what they thought was going to be in this budget, given the way that the economy is both here in Victoria and across the country?
Yeah, I think that there's been a perception building for some time that this was going to be a really difficult budget. I don't think that that's something that the government has ever shied away from. Tim Pallas always calls himself a pessimist, and that's something that he's really branded himself on in the 9 years that he's been Treasurer. He likes to give really frank, really black and white information when he's talking about the situation that he's dealing with, because that's the situation that we're dealing with as a state. So acting on a no surprises type basis in the lead up to the budget meant that when people were going through the papers yesterday, there was nothing there in terms of the state's debt or some of the measures that were going to be taken that came as a massive surprise to people.
Were you in the budget lockup? Is that? I mean, pardon my ignorance, but I'm assuming they do that as well, right? In Victoria, I know that we've had some of your colleagues at a federal level on the show before, and we've talked about the ins and outs, the inside the beltway kind of thing about a federal budget. But I'm assuming that that's the same deal for a state budget as well, yeah?
That's right, yeah. So they have a media lockup for all the journos and then a stakeholder budget lockup for the rest of us. And it's a really good opportunity to hear from the Assistant Treasurer, Danny Pearson, from the Premier as well, about the sorts of things that they're trying to achieve through this budget. So Danny Pearson, when he gave his address, he talked about this needing to be a twofold budget. So an example of the state trying to stimulate the economy through new jobs and new initiatives, while also paying down the budget debt as well. And when the Premier was on his feet, that was the first time that we had heard about the fact that the state's forestry industry is going to be winding up far sooner than what was expected as well. And the Premier was really open about the fact that that was going to be a really difficult announcement for the Longy industry to hear. And that's why the state government was committing $200 million to help with that transition process as well, because it is quite difficult to transition workers. And as the Premier said, you've got to do more than just helping people out with their resumes. So that was probably the big news for those of us in the stakeholder lockup yesterday. In terms of some of the mechanisms that the government's going to be using to pay down debt that was built up over the pandemic, some of the measures were a bit of a surprise, but the need to really address that debt was something that everyone was really waiting to hear more about.
So before we jump into sort of the details that were in the budget papers, I keen to get a sense of how it was reported by the mainstream media on Wednesday morning. For example, our friends at the Herald Sun, I'm keen to get a sense of how they put it on their front page.
Yes, well, the Herald Sun didn't do the sort of cartoon style that we generally see the day after a budget, unfortunately. Instead, they decided to take up the bulk of the front page with Dan made debt disaster, and then flag the fact that it's going to take 10 years to pay the debt off, and then they had a picture of the Premier on the front page.
Oh, I'm sure it's a wonderful picture of the Premier that they probably chose as well to show him in a great light. What about Fairfax? What do we get from those guys?
Yeah, so Fairfax went with a traditional cartoon, which I always look forward to seeing. It was Palace Bets the House on the front page, alluding to the fact that part of the announcements that were made yesterday about paying down that COVID debt would be increasing taxes for people that own more than one property.
Okay, so this COVID debt seems to be the key message that's coming out of this budget. Do you think that this is going to hit the right note, paying down the COVID debt? Is this going to hit the right note with those punters?
Yes, I think so, purely because the actual concept of paying down the debt, it's a really simple concept for people to get their head around, even if the different reasons and the machinations behind it are something that people aren't going to pay too much attention to unless it's something that directly impacts them. And it's been sold as the big end of town paying down the debt, which does tend to go over well. And I think too, having a look at some of the big results that we've seen from the financial reporting season from the big banks and from Qantas, that's really helped to build the case for the bigger end of town paying back governments, given that they received so much assistance throughout the pandemic.
So how is the government framing this? I guess that most households would recognise that during COVID, there was a lot of government money, taxpayers' money, spent to supporting various aspects of the Victorian economy, and obviously at a national level that happened as well. How is the government seeking to pay down this debt? Who is the folks that they're trying to seek recovery to put more cash back into the government coffers?
I think that by targeting the bigger end of town, larger businesses, that's also been a way for the government to remind people just how much assistance was provided throughout the pandemic as well. And also, too, it's been a really interesting reminder for people about just how few revenue mechanisms the state government actually has. So you've got payroll tax, you've got the GST, and you've got property taxes as well. And so obviously, while the state government has asked for more from the federal government, they have got no control over how much money comes in from the feds. So really, you've got payroll tax and the taxes that businesses are paying as one revenue stream, and revenue from the property industry as well. So Tim Pallas and the Andrews government have had to look at both of those areas to be able to see where they're going to be able to get more money in there. So it's been a really interesting point of debate, hearing people's views on the fact that independent schools where families pay more than $7,000 a year in school fees, they will now be receiving payroll tax. Sorry, not receiving, they will be taking payroll tax. And while there has been a bit of criticism about that in terms of that expense being passed on to families, it was interesting to hear the amount of talkback callers that were saying, well, we just would have presumed that those schools are already paying payroll tax.
The levies on businesses and owners of multiple properties. Talk to us about what actually that looks like. Who is going to have to pay this levy? I was talking to someone who actually is a Victorian, but living over here in New Zealand at the moment, and they were complaining about it tonight. I didn't have any clarity over, is it your second property? Is it a property you're not living in? How much is the levy? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, sure. So it will not be anything to do with the family home. It will impact properties that are either a rental property or a holiday home. It does mean, though, that people that are essentially rent vestors, so people that are renting a property where they want to live but own elsewhere, because that's not their principal place of residence, then they will be paying that tax. And some people feel like that's not particularly fair. Although the flip side of that is that because of negative gearing, that is an amount that would be able to be recuperated come tax time. At the moment, too, in Victoria, we are experiencing such a tight rental market. Vacancies are only 1%, and normally to be considered balanced, you want a rental market that has about a 3% vacancy. So there's also a lot of fears too, and a lot of landlords have come out already online or on Talkback Radio saying that they will be passing those expenses onto their tenants as well. So there is a question mark at the end of the day about who will be actually paying that money. The state government might be putting the impost onto landlords and onto businesses, but how it filters down and gets paid, that's where people are starting to turn their attention to today. So on the one hand, the big end of town is quite aggrieved about this, but there are also a lot of people that are paying school fees and paying rent that are worried that they will be paying for the state to be paying down their debts as well.
Leading into the budget, there was a lot of discussion. In fact, I ended up doing I remember I did my radio spot on ABC with Raf Epstein, and there was a week that I did it, and Raf wasn't in, and I had that's a terrible forgotten name. She does the news on the ABC on during the week. I can't remember her name anyway. It's terrible. Sorry, apologise to her. But she asked me a question. She asked me a question about the budget, and I was like, I looked at it like going, dude, I'm on this show to talk about like politics and campaigning. Please don't ask me a question about, economics. But the question was like, are we expecting to see a lot of job cuts? And how much politically is this going to impact the Premier and the net ratings of the government? So there was a lot of talk and a lot of chatter going into this budget that there was going to be a lot of job cuts, particularly in the Victorian Public Service. What have we seen out of this budget?
Yes, that's something that the CPSU has been warning the government against doing for quite some time. And the union has also been calling on the government to stop relying so heavily on external consultancies too. And that was something in the lead up to the state election, the state government said that they would be cutting back their reliance on consultancies as part of trying to deliver $500 million in savings over the next 4 years. But it does look like there will be cuts to the public service, and the state government has been quick to point out just how much numbers grew over the pandemic, particularly when it came to really beefing up those industries where we needed a lot of workers quite quickly. And so there will be some pain over the next couple of years. And at the moment too, I think that there's a lot of public servants that just want a bit of clarity around where that exactly is going to be. So even though that was flagged in this budget, and there were some talks about some more conservative numbers, it's still a bit unclear whereabouts those cuts will actually be, and whether or not it will be more in the service delivery side of things, or whether it will come in the form of major projects not going ahead at the rate that we had originally expected they would do.
I understand the major projects because there are obviously a lot of them, but what do you mean by service delivery? What does that look like, practically speaking?
Yeah, so I think too for a lot of people that are working in the healthcare system, in the education system, they're wanting to know whether or not they still have job certainty at the moment, and that's something that both the Premier and the Treasurer were really keen to clarify yesterday, that in terms of the day-to-day running of Victoria, we're not going to have less teachers, we're not going to have less healthcare workers, but it's something that the opposition has also been really quick to point to. When we talk about the public service being cut, that's where people tend to want to pay the most attention.
But we won't get a sense. What I'm taking from what you're saying here is that we won't actually get a sense of actually where those cuts will take place at this point in time. Is that right?
No, that's right. And in some ways that makes a lot of sense, because it does need to be done in consultation with departments. And, the budget was only released yesterday, and I don't think that there would be a huge amount of appreciation for the government coming out saying, well, here's the budget and here's exactly where those cuts are going to be, without that consultation happening. But by the same token, the uncertainty that gives people, that can be quite troubling, and it can also add to broader economic uncertainty as well.
Yeah, and I completely understand where those workers were coming from, but I think it's pretty rich of the Liberal Party talking about, there's going to be cuts to the public service when they've spent every time they've been in government as being sort of cuts. I mean, they literally are the cuts party, as we know. Cost of living measures, obviously, this is a big issue here in Australia. I only say that because I'm over in New Zealand at the moment, and obviously the main talk going into this election for the Labor Party, the Labor government here in New Zealand, is the central issue is cost of living. And I'm just wondering about what kind of things that we saw in the budget that would address the cost of living, because going into the Victorian State election last year in November, cost of living was the central issue that Labor campaigned on and were successful in getting re-elected.
Yes, that's right. And in the lead up to the election, when you've got so many announcements being made every single day, it can be really difficult to make sure that there is cut through on each of those initiatives when they are announced. So the budget's also been a really good way for the government to remind people about just how many different measures there have been to address cost of living. Things like bringing back the SEC to bring down power bills. There is another round of power saving bonus, which has also taken off like a rocket, just like the previous versions of the power saving bonus have as well. It's also been another opportunity for the Premier and the Treasurer to remind people that there's going to be another round of level crossing removals happening across Melbourne as well. And things like school upgrades, 50 new childcare centres, and women's healthcare clinics as well. So there's a lot being done in terms of easing the cost of living by increasing services through things like childcare and healthcare, and also those sorts of initiatives that create new jobs and drive that economic activity that's really going to help with the state's recovery as well.
You mentioned at the top of the program about the forestry announcement. Just sort of walk us through exactly what this announcement is. And I think my follow-up question will be about how that's been received by our brothers and sisters in the timber union.
So for some time now, we've expected that Victoria's native forest logging industry was going to come to a complete halt by the end of 2030. And over the last 12 months, that timeline has gradually been walked back based on what's happening with the logging market, and also because it is an area that the state government has been wanting to transition out of as well. So when the budget was handed down yesterday, it was announced that logging would actually be wrapped up by the end of this year, which would have come as a shock to those workers that thought that they had some certainty in terms of that industry still being extended for a few years yet. And I mean, around the inner city especially, there have been a lot of people that have been calling for the native forest industry to be shut down for quite some time. And there are a lot of us that really don't want to see our native forests logged. I'm more than happy to put my hand up and say that I'm one of them. But at the same time, there are a lot of workers that have just been working within the forestry industry for their entire careers, and these are in communities that are built on the back of the forestry industry. So when we talk about an industry being shut down, it has a tremendous impact on a lot of families, and there are a lot of workers that have been experiencing really serious mental health issues there for quite some time. That's what we've been hearing from the unions, and there are a lot of fears from workers that perhaps expect to never work again and don't really know what life beyond logging looks like. So while it's fantastic for the Victorian forests that they're going to be saved and won't be logged for profit anymore, I don't think that it's really in good taste to be celebrating quite loudly when there are people that are quite devastated by yesterday's announcement.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energise the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. Okay, let's talk about stamp duty for industrial and commercial properties. I understand there's been some changes in that area as well. Can you tell us about that?
So with brand new property purchases that are going to be made after the 1st of July this year, they will have the option of not paying stamp duty up front. So instead that will change to a broad-based land tax, which will kick in a decade after the purchase has been made. So what that means is for businesses that are looking to purchase new premises, it might actually be possible for them to start having a look around some suburbs that may have been far too expensive for them to even consider, given how much property prices have increased in recent years as well. And the upside of that for workers means that we will be having a more business activity where we have workers rather than new businesses that are buying properties on the urban fringe. And what we at McKell have been calling for quite some time is for there to be a transition to a broad-based land tax across the residential property market as well as with commercial and industrial. But I think it will be quite some time before we start to see that sort of change in the residential market too. But it ultimately would be a really good thing to happen, given that stamp duty can be one of those decisive factors that people that otherwise might be able to downsize and get into something a bit smaller. So what the cuts to stamp duty for industrial and commercial properties means that after July 1, there will be a shift from paying stamp duty upfront when a commercial or industrial property is bought into a broad-based land tax. And so after 10 years of that purchase being made, that's when the property owner will start to pay a land tax. There will be consultation over the next 12 months before that's brought in to help the property industry get their heads around that, and to also make sure that it's brought into place in a way that doesn't disturb the market too much. But the upside of that is that a lot of commercial and industrial businesses that may have been looking out on the urban fringe where land is so much cheaper may actually start doing business in areas that are closer to workers. And so that's better from a community perspective, and also I think shows just how different the industrial and commercial property markets are to what happens in the residential market. So with the residential market, in an ideal world, we would also see this shift happening as well, where we would be moving to a broad-based land tax, because we have already seen that happen in a couple of states as it is. And from a McKell perspective, we think that is the way to go, because it's a really good way to get empty nesters to consider selling their larger homes and moving into something smaller. But for now, the state government's priority is about stimulating new growth in the business sector by getting industrial and commercial properties on the move.
What other aspects of the budget that stood out for you that's worth mentioning for our listeners?
Yeah, so there was something that was quite interesting in BP3 was about a new government-owned land database being set up. So that's something that's going to happen within the Department of Premier and Cabinet. What I like about that is the fact that there is so much government-owned land across the state that's just sitting there vacant. And while there is a land disposal strategy in place for vacant land to be brought onto market, it can be quite slow moving. And it's not always the land that's right for residential development that gets sold off. What we would like to see as a result of that is land around transport corridors identified, and ultimately for there to be housing strategies put in place so that we can get more residential development happening to really increase the amount of new homes that are coming onto the market. Ideally, though, we must make sure that we don't sell off too much government land, because once you sell it, you can't actually get it back again. So we would like the state government to be exploring potentially some different leasehold agreements, perhaps working with the build to rent and the rent to buy sector, and also with the community and social housing industries as well, so that we can still be keeping government in public hands, but be making sure that there is new housing development happening in areas that are really ripe for more growth.
What areas do you think that we should be pushing in terms of new housing development? I mean, I'm interested in getting McKell's thoughts on this, because obviously Melbourne has got this, it has this big urban sprawl, and I'm just wondering if this is something that we can continue to sustain. Like the city's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's a lot of areas that are pushing back against, I guess, medium to high rise development, particularly in the city, but everyone wants to live in the inner city because it's a cool place to live. So I'm just trying to get a sense of what are we seeing from this budget that is going to encourage the way that we revisit how we build our city and our communities.
Yes, I think that at this stage, it really is just the early signs that it's something that the government is starting to turn its attention to, in terms of looking at different levers that can be encouraging more density. Where we want to be seeing more growth is around the transport corridors. So things like around the new suburban rail loop stations, but also along the existing rail corridors where you do tend to get a bit of leftover land from major projects too. So in my part of the world, I live in Kensington, and between Macaulay Station and Flemington Bridge, there is a long swathe of land that runs along CityLink and the Upfield train line. And it's owned by the Department of Transport, but there's only sort of low-level commercial grade offices that sit along there. That should really be apartments, and apartments that are in the social and affordable housing market as well. So I think that there are plenty of opportunities that exist around those transport corridors, that there is also a lot of appetite from the build to rent and the rent to buy sector as well, particularly because in the federal budget we saw that there were build to rent initiatives in the form of tax breaks for investment too.
The obligatory budget question about winners and losers out of the budget. I want to get a broader sense of who you see as sort of both. I want to start on the losers and then end on a high note. Who are the winners out of this budget? But who would perceive themselves as being losers out of this budget?
Yeah, I think big business would be seeing themselves as being the losers out of the budget. But by the same token, these are the same businesses that have done quite well in recent years despite the pandemic, and really would never actually consider packing up and leaving Victoria. I think too that there would be some people that own second properties that might be feeling the pinch because of we have had successive interest rate rises, that would be questioning whether or not they should be passing on tax increases onto their tenants, or maybe even selling off their properties as well. There's also been an increase in the vacancy rate too. So that's for people that buy a property, then just leave it sitting vacant. So that vacancy rate was 2%. That's now being increased to 4%. And the state government was really quick to remind people that 4% is where New South Wales is. So that really is bringing Victoria in line with New South Wales. And in terms of properties that are sitting there vacant, to people that feel like they are losing out of that, I'd suggest putting it into the rental market. We really need more properties available for rent to really ease that pressure right now.
Particularly when you talk about that 3% margin, is an indication that it's something that needs to be addressed. Hopefully that levy can bring some change into that area. So what about the winners? Who are the winners in this budget?
So I think the winners in this year's budget are nursing staff. So we're going to be having a lot of investment for nursing staff in intensive care, high dependency and emergency departments, and also free nursing as well. Free nursing and midwifery training is going to be available, which was a massive announcement before the state election last year, which is really going to be good for also bolstering nursing numbers in Victoria as well. Um, there's also going to be the sign-on bonus for new nursing graduates in Victoria too. For mental health, there's been a lot of investment in mental health services and also in Indigenous services too. Victoria also has a fantastic pride strategy as well, and I think too that what really sets the Victorian pride strategy apart from similar strategies that we've seen in other states is the fact that the dollars are there to really back that in as well. So that's something that the Minister for Equality, Minister Shing, has been talking a lot about recently, and it was really good to see the budget really meeting what the government has been talking about in terms of supporting Victoria's LGBTQIA+ population as well. Education, there are a lot of school upgrades as well, and it's been really good to see that a lot of schools, particularly around the inner city, where you've got a lot of older buildings as well, have received building upgrades too to be able to fix some of the older facilities, and things like $40 million for air conditioning for public housing tenants as well.
Listening to you talk about this, Rebecca, because I was thinking going into this budget that it was going to be perceived as doom and gloom and, structural deficits and all that kind of stuff. But listening to your summation of the budget, it actually sounds like it's just a good Labor budget. I mean, we get it. This is really challenging economic times, so therefore there's going to be some hard decisions. But within the narrative of this Andrews Labor government that we've had now since 2014, is there anything here that you feel like is out of the ordinary in terms of the politics of this government? Like they've always been a government that has never shied away from tough decisions. And I feel like they are making some tough decisions here, but they are also trying to look after the good burgers of Victoria, both in the middle class and in the working class communities. I mean, is that a fair summation? If you were the comms director for the Andrews government, how would you be running this to the journalists after lockup?
Well, I don't think that there's any coincidence, and it certainly wasn't an accident that on the front of the budget papers, the slogan was "Doing what matters," which is what the state government had as their election slogan last year. And so by really bringing to the forefront the funding for a lot of those really, really key election commitments, and for a lot of the initiatives that this state government has really led the way on nationally as well. Things like a significant investment for the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria to enter into treaty negotiations, a lot of funding for women's services, and particularly women's healthcare services too, and continuing the work to roll out family violence measures as well.
So then thinking about this budget and then thinking into the sort of into the future, I mean, I guess we don't really, I'm interested to get your thoughts on where is the economy going, broadly speaking, at a national level and also at a state level. What does this budget seek to do in the long term for the Victorian economy, do you think? What's Tim Powell's trying to achieve here?
I think for a number of years there, the Treasurer was really proud of Victoria's AAA economic rating, and it will be interesting to see what the rating agencies have to say about the state budget over the next couple of days. Victoria has had a AA economic rating for the last year or so, and so I think that for the state to be able to get back up to that AAA rating there, while also continuing to have the job creation figures that Victoria has enjoyed for the bulk of the Andrews Labor government's 2 and a bit terms so far, and also being able to pay down the state's COVID debt too. The way that it's been talked about, and I think something that really resonates with people as well, is that we need to think about COVID debt as almost being like a credit card. It's an unhealthy debt to have. It's not the sort of debt that is creating economic gains for the state. So by clearing that and having a real focus on investing where we can be stimulating growth is something that the government's really got itself focused on, particularly through doing things like bringing back the SEC. That was something that was talked about a lot yesterday as well, and making sure that it's quite a big task, that there is a lot of momentum building towards bringing back that industry. And I think that that's something too that we're going to be seeing happen nationally as well. We certainly saw as equally as big an announcement in the lead up to the New South Wales election a couple of months ago too. So I'll be really interested to see which other states follow suit.
That's interesting. The Moody's the ratings remark, the AA thing. I used to think that meant something, and I know that I'm not an economist, so my opinions probably don't matter much. But I remember watching The Big Short and that scene when Moody's were, doing the credit ratings on the credit swaps, and the only reason we've got these ratings is because we're in competition with Standard and Poor's, and that's that moment I kind of went, what are these ratings? What do they really mean? Do they actually mean anything? I mean, is it just some sort of like Nike and Adidas competition thing going on here that actually doesn't reflect what the state of the economy is? Do we really care about what these ratings mean?
I think that it's you could almost compare them to political polls as well. If you don't want to pay too much attention to them, you can make a case for not paying too much attention to them. If they're looking good, well, then they're a really good set of numbers to be able to talk really loudly about.
There we go. Okay, I appreciate your candor on that one. I know that was a stupid question to ask, but it just annoys me. Ever since I saw that film, I was like, who cares about these ratings anymore? Okay, final wrap-up thoughts before we say farewell in terms of the budget. How's this going to play out over the next couple of days? I remember, I know maybe state-run journalists get really worked up about it, but I've got friends who are obviously in the qualitative and quantitative research industry who have said that when they've spoken to groups and focus groups and they've said, "Oh, what are your thoughts about the state budget?" And someone actually said in a group, "Oh yeah, I guess states have to do budgets as well, don't they?" Absolutely oblivious to the idea there's a state budget, but I know that the Herald Sun's getting very worked up about this budget right now. But is this really actually playing out in Voterland? I mean, how's this going to play out in the media in the next couple of days? Are we just going to move on and worry about who's going to win on the footy on the Saturday?
I think that in Victoria, we're always going to be more focused on what's going to happen with the footy on Saturday. And this week, we've had some pretty big resignations in the footy world as well. And I think that is probably going to be what a lot of people remember about the week of the 23rd of May, more so than the state budget. But I think too, for a lot of people, being able to start to absorb the message over time that Victoria is getting out of debt and getting over COVID is something that people are going to feel pretty good about.
Brand Andrews, as always, love it. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time tonight. I do appreciate you coming on. I know you've got a lot on your plate at the moment, but to sit down and quickly give us a bit of a nice speed round update on the Victorian budget, we really greatly appreciate it. And we wish you the best of success at McKell, Victoria, going forward.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.